Hello, this is Praccy, and this is going to be a review for Electronic Superjoy on the PC. First of all, if you have photosensitive epilepsy, you might want to find yourself some sunglasses or just squint or something, because this game is a little bit stroby. In fact, I can say from first-hand experience that after playing this game for too long and then looking away from the screen, it made me have one of those sort of virtual acid trip experiences where everything looks like it's moving for a few seconds. So, you've been warned. Now this should be quite an easy review because at its heart Electronic Superjoy is just a platforming game, but it is a platforming game more in the style of Super Meat Boy or the I Wanna Be series, and not so much the Mario series or Sonic series. In fact, I've taken to calling this particular type of platforming game a frustrate 'em up because of the heavy emphasis on the repetition of the levels until you can get to grips with the extremely precise platforming elements. Also, moving through the levels, they progress from being simply just jumping around from platform to platform and avoiding enemies into like low gravity areas or double jumping and flying and things like that. So you are gently eased into the game until you have a mastery of multiple mechanics that you'll need to complete the later levels. That said, this is still a difficult game, and I'll be getting onto that a bit more later. As you probably noticed sometime between your second and third seizure while you were watching this video, Electronic Superjoy has a very sort of trippy, ravey strobe lighting art style, where the background is put there specifically to be annoying and distracting during the game. And to go with that, the environments are sort of fairly simple pixel art, which is something that you often see from indie developers like this, which I assume is because it's fairly low in production costs. It's somewhat in fashion at the moment, and it's easy to do. That's not to say it looks bad though. In fact, I quite like mostly everything about the art style in this game. It's just I'm getting a little bit tired of these 8-bit platformers by now. But perhaps even more importantly than any of the visual elements in the game is the soundtrack, which it is safe to say is meant to be one of the main selling points of this game. In fact, when you get into the game, there's a dedicated button in the menu to buy the soundtrack, almost as if people do actually buy music nowadays. But the developers are right to be confident in the soundtrack because it is particularly excellent, doing a good job of spanning quite a few genres of electronic music, going from things with somewhat of a house style to something more like a dubstep style. And I honestly don't think that any of the tracks are particularly weak. The only issue that I have is that I don't particularly like dubstep, so every time one of the dubstep tracks came on I was taken out of it a tiny bit. But there's going to be people out there that love that shit, and it's very unlikely that they're going to be disappointed. So overall, I would have to say that the presentation elements of this game are very impressive, and much to the game's credit. When it comes to difficult platforming games like this, if it didn't have an interesting presentation, it really would fail to attract very much attention. So I do think that the developers have done exactly what they needed to do here. Moving along to the gameplay, things are pretty much as you would expect. It doesn't take a rocket scientist to understand a platforming game. You just start at the beginning of the level and you try to get to the end without dying. That's it, that's the whole complexity of the game. And it's important to note when it comes to platforming that the controls for this game were perfectly fine. I found them completely responsive and I was never really frustrated with them, which I would have to say is probably the bare minimum standard given the difficulty of the game. Anything less than that and the game would simply be too annoying to play. This brings me on to my next point, which is the difficulty. Now, I'm going to go off on a slight tangent here, because before I even made this review, I looked up quite a few popular YouTubers to see what they had to say about this game, and for some reason, almost all of them were terrible at this game. Now, I don't consider myself some sort of pro player or anything like that. In fact, I would say at best I'm probably very slightly above average at these difficult platforming games, but watching other people play it has enlightened me to the fact that some parts of the game that I found easy, other people are going to find extremely hard. So please take it with a pinch of salt when I say that I think the first half of the game is maybe a little bit too easy, seeing as I think I more or less breezed through it in about 40 to 45 minutes. Now the second half, I think the difficulty is just fine there, because that is hard to the point where it is maybe a little bit unfair at times, and I think that is why you get the real longevity out of these games. Now, it's probably important to note that a lot of the footage in this video is cherry-picked, so to try and show off as much of the game as possible, I did cut out quite a lot of my deaths, but the difference between the first half of the game and the second half of the game is that in the first half, usually I would have died maybe 4 or 5 times on a level, then finish it, whereas in some levels in the second half, I would die 20 to 30 times on one section of a level, so there is quite a skill curve going on there. But things are alleviated quite a bit by the checkpoint system, which works exactly as you would imagine. If you run across a checkpoint and you die, you go back to the checkpoint. But interestingly, the developers included a restart button that takes you back to the checkpoint, which is very handy, considering that a lot of the levels aren't really worth continuing if you get a bad start. You really might as well just press the restart button and give it another go. I do have a couple of gripes with the gameplay though, mainly being the random elements to some of the levels. The best example would be probably the missiles that follow you, which are introduced fairly early on, but towards the end of the game become quite ridiculously annoying. So eventually in the game it becomes necessary to manipulate the paths of these missiles in order to make sure that they are minimized as a threat later on in the level. But the problem is this is very difficult to do reliably, because very small differences in your movement, and I'm talking pretty much pixels, early on in a level, just as a missile is launched, can have massive effects on its ultimate trajectory towards the end, which can be a very significant problem when towards the end of the level there is a mandatory jump that requires you to jump as far as you can, meaning that you only have one possible path that you can jump along, and if one of the missiles happens to be travelling across that trajectory too, you're fucked. So some of the later levels do involve this sort of manipulation of random elements, whereby you might need to do some kind of nonsensical moves towards the start of a level just to make sure that some things aren't a threat towards the end of it. I would say that my second main gripe with the gameplay is that there are quite a lot of auto-scrolling levels, which if you didn't already know means that the stage scrolls at its own pace, so you can never progress through a level faster than the level wants you to. And although these levels are quite well executed, I think it's just a personal preference that I don't like having artificial barriers put on the way that I would like to play the game. Also, it can get a little bit frustrating if you're repeating a section of a level over and over and over, and the stage is just going very slowly the whole time, and all you want to do is desperately get to the one part in the level that you can't do perfectly. Probably the final thing to talk about is the amount of replayability you can get in this game, which is, I would say, fairly decent, although still heavily linked to the difficulty, assuming you can complete the 3 main worlds in the storyline, which I honestly believe that most people probably could if they put their minds to it, and also assuming that you manage to pick up all of the extra stars hidden around the levels, usually in really annoying and painful places. Then you can access the 4th world, which is only I think about 4 or 5 levels, but they are punishingly difficult to the point where they are genuinely frustrating beyond belief. So if you're a bit of a completionist, they are there to play. Also, if you're a bit of a masochist, they are there to play. In addition to that, I think this Christmas the developers released a few new levels, sort of holiday themed levels, but I haven't really looked at them yet. Finally, there's one last game mode where you can infinitely play through a series of short levels randomly selected, just to see how many you can get done in a row without dying, which I don't think is going to sell any copies, but it's a nice little extra thing to have in the game. So, overall, yes, I think I really would recommend Electronic Superjoy. It's not for everyone, mind you. If you have absolutely no interest in difficult platforming, then you're not going to find anything to electronically super enjoy here. But if this is the type of genre that you do enjoy, then I think you'll find something with more or less the right level of challenge to not step over the line and become a chore to play. And if you do start getting a little bit frustrated with some of the levels, which you probably will eventually, then the excellent presentation of the game and the pretty awesome soundtrack should really go quite a long way to holding your interest, despite the frustration. Well, this has been Praccy. As usual, I hope somebody found this interesting and useful. Please don't bother to subscribe, like and comment unless you really feel like it. But if you do, then thanks. And maybe I'll see you next time.